Welcome to the Fortean Winds podcast, where we talk about UFOs and all of its related high strangeness. I go by the name of Bones, and with us is the notorious Ramex.
Hey, everybody.
So, obviously, we got to talk about drones, but we're going to wait for the second segment. We're going to work in segments now. That's what podcasters do. So, that's what I was told. But the first segment, we're going to talk about the occult, and I don't know much about it, and so I'm looking forward to what you got to say there.
Awesome. Yeah. So we've talked in previous episodes about where the overlap is between UFOs and the occult. Some of the strongest overlaps are between mediumship and remote viewing, things that normally people term as psychic, and UFOs. But there's other overlaps as well. And I wanted to get into some of those. But most people don't know what the occult is.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of misconceptions about what it is. So I think we're going to have to clear some of those up before we even discuss where the overlaps are.
Yeah, because when you brought it up, my mind instantly went to UFO cults. It's like, oh, cults. Yeah, I know cults, but that's not
right.
Yeah.
Good place to start. All right, so occult does not mean cult. Two different things.
Right.
So cults are defined by a bunch of characteristics, especially brainwashing, essentially, and peer pressure, a lot of intense tactics to create a pliable mind that they can manipulate. So that's like cults. And they also have a belief in a supernatural source, too. But occult refers to something that is hidden. That's where the word comes from. It comes from the Latin occulare, and it means to hide or hidden.
Okay.
And this is like hidden knowledge. So the first thing I would say is it's not religion dependent. Okay. And I think it often gets mixed up with witchcraft, and it's not necessarily witchcraft. That's a whole other thing, but we won't talk about witchcraft right now because we're talking about the occult.
I mean, is it dependent on like the supernatural? Then they believe in supernatural things. Kind of.
It is dependent on unknown forces and unseen forces and entities.
Yeah.
So you could see where the overlap comes in. We've talked a lot about non-local consciousness, and these things are meant to manipulate non-local consciousness. So there's another good point of intersection between UAP and these studies. I mentioned that occult is not religion dependent. And that means that it spreads across religions. So a good way to start would be Jewish occult traditions. There's Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism.
Right.
And then there's Christian occult traditions. For example, I just did a AI analysis of a bunch of grimoires, and I've completed this series. And that's why we're kind of talking about this and the drones together, is because I started this AI analysis of these grimoires over the holidays, and I thought, oh, cool, I'm going to kick back and do this fun little project, very Fortean project over the holidays, and it'll be chill. And then the drone thing blew up and kept going, so obviously we've been doing that, but I have finished this series, and I want to put it out slowly and talk about it a little bit, because I think it was really cool and potentially informative. It's a new point of view.
Nice.
I'm not an occult scholar,
Right.
And I think that's why several people that I know and really like and who I trust in the field were very interested in me pursuing this and seeing if I can prove the overlap, because I don't come from that world. So they knew I was going to kind of look at it nuts and bolts technology-wise.
Right.
In order to do that, I had to become familiar with the history. So I thought this was going to be good because most people are probably not. And like you said, occult, and then they're not really aware that these are spread out amongst different religions. You could also include shamanistic practices, hidden knowledge, right? That's passed from one shaman to another would be a great example of occult knowledge.
Okay. Makes sense.
And many people probably don't know, and we included them in some of this grimoire analysis, that popes have written some of those grimoires. They wrote spell books.
Wow. Okay.
And these spell books work just like a lot of the other spells in ritual magic in the occult, where they have timing and then they have symbols and chanting. And we talked previously about how all of those things can help get you into a state that has been measured and proven to be correlated to people who have undergone something like an alien abduction. So again, I see a massive overlap there. So there's also occult traditions in the Middle East. We should discuss that. And then there's occult traditions in the Far East, magical traditions, Japan, China, strong magical traditions. And so it was interesting to take a look at all of those and go, is there underlying similarities? Is there a pattern? Are they all tapping into something? And I found a bunch of things. So it's going to be interesting to talk about those at some point. And what they involve is a lot of astrology. So there's a lot of numbers that are important. 3, 7, 12, things like that are really important to the occult.
Okay.
And Keel pointed out how important the number 3 seemed to be to the phenomenon. And some of these beings and encounters keep talking about the number 3. And then, we have obviously the number 3 represented very strongly in religions like the Trinity.
The Trinity, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So in many of these occult traditions, they bridge science, philosophy, religion, spirituality, alchemy, chemistry, astronomy.
Right.
They really abridged everything. And then in the 16th century, that's kind of when occult sciences take off. And those are really starting to use the scientific method to develop some of these occult practices, which means that they would rinse, lather, repeat when it comes to science, right? They'd say, okay, let's make a little change one part of the ritual and see if that works. Okay, that didn't work. Let's change another part, etc. So they would do the scientific method and then presumably would get results and then stick to those results and write those results down in spell books. So let's talk about what occult is not, because that often gets really mixed up. Occult is not necessarily evil. The most famous occultist, we've talked about him before, is Aleister Crowley, at least of the 20th century.
Right.
Jimmy Page was into him.
Oh, that's right.
The 70s, there was a Crowley revival. He comes back a lot, but he was just the most famous one. And he was a bit of a showman, I think, more than anything.
So, yeah, that guy was kind of on the edge of being a pop culture figure, basically, back then.
Yeah, he hung out with artists, and it was cool to know Crowley for a little while. It's worth pointing out that he died penniless and drug addicted and in a bad way. So the occult didn't lead him to riches and a life of pure happiness.
Right.
But anyway, it's not inherently evil. Crowley liked to call himself an antichrist. A lot of occultists tend to get really provocative and confrontational towards Christianity. Jack Parsons, who we mentioned, and he was big into the occult. And he was part of the reason we got to the moon, Jack Parsons, the rocket scientist. And you can go back and hear some of our stories about him or read some. He was doing these Babylon working rituals in the desert with L. Ron Hubbard from Scientology.
Oh, okay.
And many people believe that some of these rituals may have triggered some ideas in him that helped us get to the moon.
What? That I didn't hear. Huh. That's interesting.
Yeah, that's what he was praying for to these, pagan gods.
Right.
So even though occultists tend to get provocative or confrontational towards religion, it's not necessarily opposed to religion. Sometimes it runs parallel. But it is secret knowledge, and it is past. And then that gets into these different occult groups. And in these different occult groups, you've got like Rosicrucians, you've got the Order of the Golden Dawn, that was the one that Crowley was famously associated with, and then a number of others, right? And the knowledge within that group gets passed around. Some people have pointed out there's a lot of similarities, and there is. There is some shared history between the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians. That means that they have some of the same traditions, and some of those traditions involve like this esoteric passing of knowledge. And one of the famous statements that many people in the Masons have made is that there's a house in the Mason ideology, and in the house there's many rooms. There's like a top floor, and depending on where you are and who you are, you get to know all the knowledge. And that's a good way to exemplify how occult knowledge tends to be kept in these groups.
Yeah, and I never thought the Masons would be in that category, but yeah, that's really interesting.
I am not referring to the Masons as a cult. I'm just saying that they have some shared history, and that the rumors of how they structure their knowledge tends to look like a cult.
Okay.
You could read into that how you will, and I'm sure there's some people in our audience who are like, I knew it.
Yeah, right.
And that's up to you. I don't really know too much about Masonic conspiracies. But the occult is also not necessarily supernatural. And it also sometimes it emphasizes symbolic interpretations. Like, let's take, for example, one of the most famous occult workings, which is the idea of the philosopher's stone, or turning lead to gold.
Oh, okay. Yep.
So many people, and I tend to think it's this because it's sort of my own journey with UFOs, I think, mirrors this, where it's more of a analogy, and it's more of a metaphorical journey of turning lead to gold in sort of these occult initiations, and it allows you to turn your life from something crappy into something great,
right,
and something fun, and happiness and balance and harmony, things like that. So in those cases, sometimes the occult is not really focused on the supernatural. It's more like a self-help sort of ideology.
Okay.
So while the occult also sometimes overlaps with religion, it doesn't necessarily require religion. It usually emphasizes personal exploration over dogma or fundamentalism. It's like, okay, encourages you to go and feel the Lord. And like, look at Joseph Smith. That's a great example of someone who was into the occult. Super Christian, read his Bible every day, prayed. He gets this vision from an angel, and then the angel also helps him find these tablets. But first he has to go get this scrying stone, which is a very occult practice. And, he was heavily into these occult traditions. And all through the 19th and 20th century, it wasn't really verboten for gentlemen, especially academic or intellectual gentlemen, to get involved in this subject. So we should mention where occult history sort of begins. And as far as we know, I think, and most occult scholars would pin it in Egypt. And that's when some of these ideas started growing. And there's a big question with occult knowledge, which is, did ideas start there that ended up going into the Rosicrucians, that ended up going into the Catholic Church, that ended up coming out and getting involved in like Orders of the Golden Dawn and groups like that? So there's a lot of questions about that stuff. And people trade these secrets and pursue these secrets, this occult knowledge, with great passion. And it's interesting, but I would also say it's left people very prone to manipulation.
Ah, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, sure.
It's left people prone to con artists.
Sure.
Like, do whatever I say, and at some point I'll tell you the magic words.
Yeah, right.
This is done all the time. And as better occult scholars, more familiar occult scholars than I have pointed out, that this is very common among occult groups, that these con artists say that they have knowledge that they don't. They get these people into it, and they play out a little LARP with them, and it's pretty sad. It's not uncommon in religions. Obviously, there's grifters all over this. People want to believe, and there's people who want to take advantage of the believers.
Right.
So, and the other thing that these people at the top of these groups, and again, many scholars have pointed this out. I'm not intimately familiar with any of these groups, but they have pointed out that the people at the top of these groups tend to be way less serious than the people in the groups.
Oh, okay.
Right. And the people at the top of the groups understand that they're like, we're getting dressed up in robes and getting everybody, a few little lit up, and we're going to have an orgy or whatever. And,
Right.
and they all think we're going to get rich. Or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
That'd be a weird, like Crowley-esque example of a con artist, but you could translate that into whatever group. So occult history begins kind of in Egypt, as far as we know. It spreads into Mesopotamia, and then after Mesopotamia, it goes into Greece and Rome. And then after Rome, that's when the Catholic Church sort of gets involved, and we see popes get involved, saints, even priests and nuns get involved. So there's all sorts of overlaps there. And then the 20th century happens and the Crowley stuff. And that even brings us to today, where you now have an entire online and internet world that's devoted to the occult, very popular. And there was I should mention, there was a pretty big occult revival in the 90s. There's a occult revival in every decade, obviously.
Yeah. But how would you classify that, the one from the 90s?
Oh, the crow, everyone walking around wearing onks. There was a focus on Sarah McLachlan, albums.
Right.
Like, come out at night, where you sleep with voodoo dolls,
Man, the 90s were awesome.
They were. And we were wearing Birkenstocks while we were, like, jamming out. It was great.
So what you're trying to say is, as researchers, you got to try to use the occult or knowledge of the occult to find kind of inner knowledge or hidden knowledge, or why study the occult, I guess, is my question.
Well, I think that's a great question, because this gets into the two paths of the occult. There's the right-hand path and the left-hand path. And somebody like Crowley would have been a follower of the left-hand path. So they follow the occult and get involved in the occult. Crowley was devoted to finding things that worked. Like, he didn't want to mess around with anything that was metaphorical or things like that.
Okay.
And then there's the right-hand path, which is, I'm in a pursuit that is going to be beneficial to me and others in a positive way to the world, things like that.
Okay.
So that would be another reason to get involved in the occult, is you want to better the world around you. And then, we've talked about how much intent matters to these beings and how much even UFOs, it's kind of relevant to what's happening right now, is that they come down and they seem to read intent around people.
Right.
And they can tell the difference if you're lying or not. And it's not good and evil. That's different, right? Yeah. Intent is something else. So it can be good and it can be evil, but it's also, they know which one you are, right? And if you're telling them you're something else, if you're pretending to be something else and your intent is different, they're going to know it. And that makes you, I think, in trouble.
So, the occult instantly for me, I always think of a pentagram, right? The shape of a pentagram, because that's just a cultural thing. That you hear occult and a pentagram instantly has to be shown, which is what was, I guess, paganism, right? But that's a shape. It's a sacred symbol. And I remember you mentioning a while back about some like sacred geometry and how that could be related.
Right. So that was where the AI analysis is eventually going. And I've finished those articles, so I know where they're going. And there is some interesting stuff in the math in those symbols and sigils. And maybe I think this will be informative for people who are into those studies, like I said. But there's definitely a possible overlap between UFOs and the occult on that level, of the level of shapes and symbols and sigils. So we talked about hieroglyphs being on the sides of these crafts, and it's possible. And I mentioned that the CIA covered up what one of the hieroglyphs looked like, and they did so by putting forth a disinformation piece, which was that the symbol was something else. So they weren't saying that the craft didn't exist. They were just trying to lie about what the symbol looked like.
Really? Was that important?
Right. that's what got me thinking, why would this symbol be so important to them? And there's an idea that I have, and maybe other people do out there too. There's a guy on YouTube I'll link to, and he has an interesting experiment that he's doing with a laser in DMT, where he's shooting a laser through DMT. And many people have talked about how DMT gives them a glimpse into some greater reality or some idea, machine that we all are looking into. Some people have thought that they've seen code while in DMT. So he shoots a laser through DMT and he projects it onto a surface. And sure enough, the surface has code all over it.
What?
It has letters. And you can see it on YouTube. You can watch the people do it. And this experiment has now been replicated, and I think it's been validated. So if you shoot a laser through DMT and project it on the surface, you'll see different code written on the surface.
So you know what? I don't even know what DMT is. It's a psychedelic, right?
So you're not cool and hip anymore.
I'm not in the in crowd. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a psychedelic, and it's used recreationally, but it does occur naturally in your brain too. It's dimethyltryptamine, and it has a psychoactive effect. And people who've taken this have said that they have seen code or met machine elves, which look remarkably like UFO nauts or UFO pilots.
Wow.
So, yeah, there's a very interesting intersection between UFO and DMT that a number of people are studying.
Huh. All right.
So he shoots a laser through DMT, gets this thing on the surface, and then, everyone starts theorizing, right? Does this mean we live in a simulation? If you're projecting code onto the surface of a table and you wrote different code onto the table, would it then be a chair?
Right.
Or a jetpack? Yeah. So, it could be a number of things. And that sort of matches what we're seeing with UFOs. We're seeing things that definitely, we've mentioned it so many times, that the only realm in science where we see anything that remotely like this that could explain UFO and anomalous phenomenon is in quantum mechanics. So it makes sense. It does follow. And I think it's very interesting. And maybe, again, it's experiments like that are causing the phenomenon to be so much more active.
Okay. And, yeah, maybe.
Which brings us to today, I guess. Yeah, maybe we should roll into the drones. But I want to come back to the occult. And I'm going to start releasing those other articles, and we'll talk about them as I do.
Okay.
Because then we're going to get more into the sacred geometry and what we actually found in those.
Right.
But I thought it was necessary to sort of set the stage of what is the occult.
Yeah.
And it's more like pursuit of hidden knowledge and pursuit of, power for good or bad.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm going to definitely read up on that more. Just to look into the connection between the UAPs and the occult. That's awesome.
Yeah, cool. So we'll and they're not necessarily like directly correlated to the UFO drones.
But
so this is going to be a classic Fortean Winds episode.
Right.
It's going to be like the occult and Jersey drone UAPs.
Right.
Like, I love it.
I'm gonna go way off, but off base here. But when you say sacred geometry, I think of I always go back to that cube within a sphere that was seen by those pilots, those Hornet pilots.
Yeah,
I always think of that.
The fact that you keep pointing to that as a break into the glimpse behind the curtain.
There's something there.
It gives me pause, truthfully.
Yeah.
The fact that you think that. There's a couple other people, like I know Greg Caldwell from the Higher Side Chats. He was like, I'd be interested if you finish that AI analysis. And then another person I met at the Soul Foundation said the same thing. And I'm like, so many people whose opinions I respect have said that there's something here.
Yeah.
We'll keep looking into it. I actually started a book on the subject because I was like, I can't wrap my brain around this, and this is the only way that I'm gonna ever understand it, is to write it down and structure it.
Right.
I don't know what we're gonna do with all that yet. Maybe someday I'll release a book. I don't know. Maybe we'll put it on the website. I have no idea yet.
If we're going to segue into the drone story, if you're talking about shapes, there are definitely triangular shaped drones that have been reported. For sure.
Yeah, triangular shape has been reported. And there's so many orb sightings. I guess that's a good way to start, is that, first of all, the so-called UAP drones have never stopped. I understand people are saying that story went dead.
Yeah.
We have an article that's, doing pretty well on Facebook right now in terms of getting visibility, and it's the case for correlation between the Langley sightings, which is what I really want to talk about from last year and today. But first, I want to say that those drone UAPs that we've been talking about have not stopped.
Nope.
They're appearing in new places. They're still appearing in parts of New Jersey. They were just appearing in Brick, New Jersey, which is right nearby a bunch of military installations. So
they just stopped. Yeah. They stopped reporting on it. It's just kind of they're just going to be commonplace. We're just going to
right. It's the new normal that these things exist. And we've also had in the midst of this a terrorist attack and terrible wildfires, and so it's understandable that they would fall to the back of the news. But they are even still in the news. I'm hearing people say they're not in the news anymore. Well, they may not be talked about on like Fox or CNN. But they're still showing up in local news reports. They're still showing up. Even other outlets that we like and are close to mainstream are still reporting on it. So they just, like you say, it's the new normal.
Yeah, there's still just regular everyday people looking up in the sky and scratching their heads. So it's not going away.
And posting lots of great videos and their experiences. So all of that's still being reported on social media directly by witnesses and with evidence. So
it's just so
nothing stopped.
It's just so different because it's just the sightings are usually so fleeting, and it's so much easier for the government to be like, the government's just saying, that's nothing. It was just a light flare or something. But it's hanging around.
It's hanging around for hours. I mean, it's like we did all that work on, what brings on a UAP and paranormal encounter? And I still think it's relevant, but all the rules are off right now.
Yeah.
I mean, these things are just showing up with impunity, and that's a good way to seg into the new thing that we have to talk about today, which is the case for correlation between these sightings that we're currently still in and began the wave. We're going to say began around November, but November 18th, to be precise. That's the way we're calling it.
Okay.
There's good debate on when they first started appearing, but we know that they appeared consistently and in somewhat large numbers over Langley Air Force Base 1 year before this latest wave of sightings.
Yeah.
Extremely significant, not being talked about. They appeared for 17 days over Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. And during those 17 days, they were appearing on the same schedule as these, starting around 6 p.m., going into the evening hours, appearing with FAA lights on them. And then both the military and law enforcement were shooting at them with all of their drone countermeasures, and none of them worked.
Right.
The same as these drones. They sent up physical drone countermeasures. Those didn't work. So it's the same thing. That's point one. No one's talking about the fact that these things showed up in smaller numbers 1 year before they showed up in larger numbers. Now let's talk about where they showed up. They showed up at Langley Air Force Base. Extremely significant because that's where Air Force Command is. So they show up for 17 days, and as we've pointed out, these things can take data. So they went to Langley Air Force Base and certainly got all of the Air Force's data on where all their assets are around the world, and then they were able to pull all of the intelligence on all of the other countries that the Air Force had gathered, right? So now they have all of our defense analysis from all over the globe, and then they show up 1 year later in much greater numbers.
Yeah.
And this time they're testing both military and public reactions, and they're gauging them.
So, I mean, the story is expanding. At first, it was kind of military bases, right? And then they started showing up, like, kind of hovering over infrastructure, major infrastructure, like nuclear plants and all that. Is that right?
Yeah, nuclear plants and dams.
And dams.
Those are the Those are the things you take out when you're getting ready to. Those are the things you take out when you're getting ready to invade. There's no other way for me to say it. I'm trying not to say that. Like Lou Elizondo terms his book imminent. You know, there's no other way to say this. I don't want to say that these things are getting ready to invade. But if you were looking at this as a defense analyst, that's the only way you could interpret this. It does make me a little suspicious, right? That Elizondo comes out in 2017. You know, that's 8 years ago. Like, he comes out, these whistleblowers come out, and here we are in the biggest UFO mass contact sighting event ever. And we are justifiably suspicious of all of that. Like, there's a saying in the military that I think comes up a lot for me in UFO research, and maybe you'll see why, is once is a fluke, twice is a coincidence, 3 times is an enemy action.
Right.
So in this case, Lou Elizondo coming out 8 years ago, and then all of this happening now would be a fluke. Lou Elizondo, Dave Grush coming out would be a coincidence. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, we're basically at the point where this is almost clearly deliberately, and I'm not saying the government's an enemy. I don't know. Like, they need to tell us whether or not they're on our side.
Yeah.
Because they're not telling us anything. But we're getting close to the point where this just looks extremely deliberate, that we were led to understand this phenomenon a little better, and that we were here with something else before all of this happened.
Right. When I read the article, one of the big points on those drones that I didn't know was that they were seen hovering for hours, which is amazing. I knew about the high altitude where they were like being seen like 30,000 feet, which would make a battery function very poorly. You
built a bus-sized drone.
Yeah, I did.
How long did that thing stay up in the air?
Not long. And then once, that was a very manual drone too, and once that LiPo battery gets to a certain percentage, that thing will go down fast. Right. So, yeah, I actually had a beeper on it to tell me that the battery was low. But, yeah, that thing was a tank.
So the size of them, combined with the power needs to keep them in the air for hours. I mean, we were both talking about this before the podcast. Obviously, batteries are out of the question.
Yeah.
So you can't make a battery that size that would power it a drone that size for hours. So that leaves you with fuel, and then you'd have to store enough fuel, which makes the size of the object much larger than just the size of a car.
Right.
To stay in the air for hours. So, and you're having to keep an object that size in the air for hours, right?
Right.
It's all relative. That's why you have to now make a bigger fuel tank to keep a bigger object in the air. That's how aeronautics kind of works.
Right.
So the idea that they were in the air for hours kind of blows it up on its own, except it doesn't have to, because then we have the extremely high altitude that we brought up before, the high-speed maneuvering, which we don't know any craft, especially not drones, that can maneuver that way.
Right.
They're beating the drone busters, which they have some extremely fast drones. So no hobby or commercial drone is doing that.
No.
And if you believe somebody else has that many faster drones than the U.S. and all of the other countries that have been trying to prevent these, then, we're in big trouble either way.
Yeah, right.
But silent operation too, like, come on. I mean, all of these things scream UAP. And that's all we know at this point.
Right.
So based on the pattern of locations, military plus critical infrastructure, I mean, that's reconnaissance. That's straight out of a military handbook. So that's the only way you can interpret it. So the big open question that I think I have is, are these surveillance? Are they testing? Are they probing? Are they looking at weaknesses in infrastructure? But that doesn't make a lot of sense. That would be approaching us the way a human army would approach us in order to invade.
Right.
These things have shown they're so much more powerful than us. Why would they need to show up as if they were a separate army.
Right. Maybe.
I think it's because they're sending a message.
Yeah, it could be. Or, I mean, maybe they're just, they're just checking up on our progress. There's always that. There's always that idea.
Well, they didn't fly over...
the Petri dish idea. The Petri dish.
Well, they didn't fly over Cornell University. I mean, they flew over military bases and dams. So were they like, oh, let's go check on their dam technology?
Yeah, right. Wow, fascinating.
They've come a long way. We'll see you in another 1,000 years.
Yeah, true.
So how are they able to evade countermeasures so effectively? And was this iterative? Like, if they're coming back 1 year later and in greater numbers, were they like, okay, the first time worked, let's make a few adjustments to the craft and come back in much stronger and see how it goes?
Right.
And if that goes well, then something else may come next. That seems to be what they're indicating. That's the message that they're sending is, look, we're getting ready to invade. But then we don't see an invasion. Oh. And as far as we know in history, there hasn't been one. So there may have been one prehistory, or there may have been one they covered up, but as far as we know, there hasn't been one. So there's no precedent for it.
And you can't brush by the fact that they're like, it's almost like an attempt to be part of the skies. They have the FAA lighting, the green and red lights, and they're not in the right position most of the time.
Yeah,
but they're trying. They're like, hey, we're legit. We're just gonna be here for a little bit. It's like, what?
Yeah.
It's bizarre as
I
hell.
saw one that looked crazy last night. It looked like a helmet. And the FAA lights were like scattered all over, like a kid putting light bright, pens in.
Right.
It's like, what the hell? Who would have done something like that? That's not FAA standard.
Right.
But that's the strange thing. And it definitely harkens back also to the airship sightings that happened in the late 1800s, 1900s. John Keel wrote a lot about these, and you can find some really good media around this. And I'll put up a good hour-long video podcast that did a really good deep dive into this. So that was these airship sightings showing up. And so around then, there was only like 3 airships in the country. And all of a sudden, airships started being seen everywhere and behaving really weird. And people were interacting with pilots who they said were like flying. And, all of this is seen as example of mass hysteria.
Mass hysteria.
Clearly it wasn't, right?
Right.
Clearly it was the same thing. But they showed up as something looking familiar, but also wildly unfamiliar, Also wildly magical almost in its way, but familiar enough, right?
Right.
Just like these FAA lights, where it's like, those are red and green and white lights, but they're scattered all over the plane.
Right, right.
So same sort of happening.
So I mean, we talk about these drones, and we know they're not drones, but we're just using that term because they're flying around and hovering. The orbs. What do we make of these orbs? Because I'm seeing all these different cases of, we talked about this in previous podcasts, but these orbs are showing up. I've seen cases where the orb is just completely still for a very long time. And I've also heard cases, I haven't seen any footage, but heard cases of orbs actually morphing into these drones.
Yeah, I've seen video of orbs that appear to be morphing into drones. It is difficult because people say, oh, well, you're just seeing the bright light of the plane or the drone or helicopter, and then it's coming into view.
Right.
So it's difficult to ascertain that, but there's been video analysts that have gone through it and said, no, it's not a bright light. It's not a reflection. It appears to be something else, and then it's changing. So, now that these orbs are showing up everywhere, and we can post some videos, and it could be part of it is the fact that people are just looking in the sky more now.
Right.
And we knew UFOs were here all along. We've been saying, like, they never stopped.
Yeah.
They're always here. They're happening all the time. We just tune them out. We're able to tune out the ones that are showing up right over our houses right now.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there we go again. We got the sacred geometry of the orb. That's a simple one, but
right.
But, but you're talking about airships being seen, hundreds of years ago or over 100 years ago, and then you think about the shape of the craft, right? You said we've had UFOs around for years now. The nuclear age comes post-war, and then the UFO shape starts to change, right? We start seeing flying saucers.
Yeah.
And what's...
Yeah, it's like they switched from being something magical to something that's more technological science fiction, right around the nuclear age.
Right.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating.
And then all of a sudden, it barely starts showing up as things like fairies or whatnot,
right?
Woodland creatures, woodland sprites, or something like that. All of a sudden, those stories start to go away, and they don't go away entirely, but they go away mostly, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, stories of aliens,
right.
Stories of abductions, it's all the same. So, yeah, like something triggered that, and now we're in this wave of an entirely new technological revolution. So like this morning, Sam Altman said, and he said this before, but I think he may be right this time, is that in 2025, we might achieve super artificial generated intelligence, which means it could potentially think and reason better than a human.
Right.
Most humans, and
yeah,
that's not hard, actually.
Yeah, right. It's easy to achieve that, right?
yeah. It's pretty easy to beat a bunch of preschoolers in basketball. I do that every time I need a pick me up. But no, I'm kidding. I do think that plus quantum physics, plus all of the advancements that we have going in energy and dark matter. I mean, the parallel universe research that's happening, somewhere within that, we're going to find out what these things maybe really are. Whether they're, what they like to appear as many different things. Maybe they are ET or whatever. But I think somewhere in there, we might be getting close, and that's what's making them appear now.
Yeah, maybe. Fascinating. Well, that seems like a good spot to end it. Thanks again, Romex. That was some good.
Thank you, Bones.
I mean, I've learned a lot. That the occult is something I'm going to look into more. It's really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I would recommend Peter Levenda's work for people who are interested. He weaves some pretty interesting occult threads through history and makes some interesting sideways allegations about people who have been involved. And I think what's most interesting about Levenda's work is that you find out how prevalent the occult is throughout our history, throughout our government.
Really?
Lots of celebrities and people, academics, and some of the weird connections between the occult.
Yeah.
Is pretty interesting, and Levenda dives pretty deep into that, some occult conspiracy stuff. Good stuff.
No, right on.
So Mitch Horowitz, too, is another person I would recommend to look into occult history.
Okay, right on. All right, well, that wraps up the Fortean Winds podcast. Thanks for listening, everyone. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, all. Appreciate you.